Hello chess fans! The World Chess Championships Rapid 4 teams are currently going on in Kazakhstan and the world's best players are participating there as well. In today's video we're going to check out the game of games, the match we all want to see. And that is Magnus Carlsen, world's #1, the GOAT, who is playing against the reigning world chess champion in classical chess from China, Ding Liren. Of course, very exciting match. Magnus, as always, is the big favorite. And we know that Ding Liren has had a tough time since he has become world champion, struggling with mental and health issues. And well, let's see if he is able to bounce back. He said in one of the interviews during this event that he's trying to get back into shape, as later this year, of course, he's going to play the World Championship match against new challenger Gukesh. Well, let's have a look. Is Ding able to cause an upset here? Well, he's playing with the black pieces. Magnus starts the game with 1 e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, a6, Spanish opening, bishop a4, knight f6, castling, bishop e7. And Magnus, as always, wants just to get a very solid game without too much theoretical stuff going on the board. He goes for the move d3, b5, bishop b3, d6, and here the move a4 played, putting a bit of pressure against the pawn on b5. Therefore black goes bishop d7, so that if you do take, you can safely recapture without worrying about the rook, as the queen defends the rook in the corner. Now, the first small surprise of the game, I would say, as in the majority of games, white players have proceeded here with the move c3. And you get this typical structure where you can go rook e1, knight bd2, knight f1, knight g3. It's typical maneuvering stuff in this opening. At some point you have the option to break in the center with d4. But Magnus goes for a move which is almost half forgotten. It's not often seen, but it perfectly makes sense, of course. Knight c3. As with this knight on c3, you're hitting the pawn on b5 one more time. Therefore, black play the move knight a5, defending the pawn with the bishop, but also trying to catch that bishop on b3. Therefore, the bishop goes back to a2, stays on this diagonal, long-term pressure against that pawn on f7. Black goes for the move b4, attacking the knight on c3. The knight goes back to e2, and here c5. Typical structure. We all know these ideas for black to grab space on the queen side. The knight is not doing too well on a5, but can always return back to c6. And now, little idea here by Magnus, which I thought is very instructive. He played here the move knight to d2. So there are two ideas of this move. First of all, knight is heading for the c4 square, so knights can be swapped. And then white's bishop has a nice control over the light squares. But there's another idea as well, as they're followed castling kingside. And now, rather than moving the knight immediately to that square, white shows the second idea now. f4. So that's the main point of moving the knight away from the f-file, as white has plans to open up the f-file for the rook and be able to develop some play on that side of the board. Now, there are still various ways of playing. And the move chosen by Ding it's still kind of thematical for these structures, as he puts the rook on the b file. Sometimes there are ideas to get in the move b4, b3 with the aim of closing the diagonal for the bishop. Even if that's a pawn sacrifice, it's still quite a nice positional idea. But looks like with the move knight c4, white is trying to seize the initiative here. So knights are coming off the board. And as I said, the bishop is looking great on this diagonal, but now it also hits the pawn on a6. So that is sort of a drawback of having committed the rook too early to the b8 square. Therefore, a5 played. But now white takes on e5. Pawn takes e5, and the knight goes to g3. So position is quite calm here, with a nice pawn formation on the queen side, nice half open f-file for the rook, and most importantly, especially in games with shorter time control, I believe that white's position is very easy to play, as you do have a number of simple moves to be played. Like you want to get out your bishop, you want to move the queen, maybe move the rook, double rooks on the f-file. So that is something white is playing for. Now, black wants to anticipate the potential pressure on the king side, puts the knight on e8, so that after queen h5, the knight comes to d6, heading to a nice square in the center, attacking the bishop on c4. And now white could have considered taking the pawn, which is not the move Magnus played, but it's actually something black would really welcome, this exchange of knight for bishop. Despite being a pawn down, looks like these bishops are pretty good with pressure against the pawn, maybe against the queen as well. Things are looking not bad at all. And Magnus is not interested in opening up the position. He moves the bishop just to d5. Look at this monster piece. It's very difficult to challenge it. Bishop f6 played now to defend the pawn on e5. And here you may think about a lot of different ideas. My first thought here was just to get the bishop to e3 to hit the pawn on c5. But the move played by Magnus Carlsen, b3, is also a very nice positional idea to lock up this side of the board. There are no pawn breaks available to black. And most importantly, you can never really go for the move c4. That square has been perfectly covered. Therefore, black kicks the queen away with the move g6. Queen goes back to f3. And here, the bishop goes to g7. Looks like the bishop is not doing that much. It's standing there behind the pawn, but it guards the king. And note that the knight on d6 and the rook on f7, they are perfectly guarding the pawn on f7. So there are no immediate threats on the king side, but there are some other concerns here for black. As the bishop now finally comes to e3, threatens the pawn on c5, rook c8, and now queen to f2, attacking the pawn another time. And how should black defend against that pawn? Well, not simple at all. They follow the move queen c7, but that's actually a serious mistake. Not obvious to see why that is. Apparently, the machine even says that you can play different moves. It recommends strange-looking move h5, maybe to kick the knight away at some point. But the main idea here is that if you ever take on c5, you do actually open up the file for the rook. So maybe there's bishop e6, trying to get rid of this bishop. If you now take on e6, you get an ugly structure. You're attacking the queen. The queen got to keep the bishop defended. But now, for instance, after something like rook c6, very strange looking position. But what I want to point out in this variation is that it's not easy for white at all to make use of these pawns on the c and d file. I think black can develop quite some nice pressure against this pawn. So things are not looking too bad. White, of course, doesn't have to take the pawn on c5 immediately, but it's very hard to evaluate for both sides the consequences of capturing that pawn. So queen c7 was played, and now the move bishop g5, very, very good move, as this bishop is now threatening to come to e7, hitting the rook, hitting the knight as well. If you can eliminate these defenders, white will be able to take on f7. And how to deal with these threats? Not simple at all. Know that even ideas like bishop f6 are also quite promising. If you are able to get rid of this bishop and infiltrate with the queen on f6, looks like black's position is starting to smell here a bit. So, well, there follow the move bishop e6. Black finally wants to get rid of this powerful bishop on d5. Now the queen covers the 7th rank, but it is a huge concession, as after taking on e6, black will end up in an endgame, or at least now with still major pieces on the board, but in a position with a lot of pawn weaknesses, especially these isolated doubled pawns on the e file. When they are coming under threat, it's much harder for black to defend them. The pawns cannot support each other, but there are other problems as well. First things first, as the queen is under threat, queen d2 played, Now, rooks are coming off the board. Black swaps and then puts the other rook on the f-file. White takes as well on f8. And here, bishop e3. Bishop's coming back to hit the pawn. Knight f7, overprotecting the pawn with both the queen and bishop. No immediate threats, but look at this. Queen f2, controlling the f-file. No immediate possibility to infiltrate, but you see that the black queen and bishop are now having a defensive task of supporting the pawn on c5. Knight to d8. And also now, what is white going to do? The bishop and queen, they are looking very nice. Knight on g3 cannot come forward. All these squares are nicely covered by the black pawns. So the knight goes back to f1. Beautiful idea. As after queen e7, knight e2, knight c6, the knight comes to c4. As from this square on, it hits both the pawns on a5 and e5. So here we see the drawback of black's position is that he is ending up in this endgame with a pretty bad bishop. The pawns are being placed on the same color, which means that if the bishop, or maybe another piece later on, is able to hit these pawns, it's likely that black is not able to save it. Black played h5, trying to do something on the king side, grabbing a bit of space, but white goes h4. Now you may think, why is white placing the pawn on that dark square color? Well, it's still defended, it's not a big problem here, but look at what Magnus's idea is now. King g7, g3, black is kind of stuck. He needs to keep the weaknesses defended, so all his pieces cannot move. King goes back to g8, waiting move, and in the meantime, white is making a bit of progress on the king side with the pawn break g4. Black captures, but now it's queen g3. And after queen f6, defending the pawn on e5, because the queen on g3 was attacking it, now there's bishop to g5. Hitting the queen. Queen goes to f7. And now it's knight takes e5. So you have managed here as white to eliminate this weak pawn. Knight takes, queen takes with check. So no chance yet for the black queen to give a check. First the king got a move. Now important move. Put a queen on the f-file. Queen f6, queen f4 was other idea. But queen f6 neutralizes potential counterplay of the black queen. Now, as I said earlier, if you go for the exchange of queens, this bishop endgame is dead lost, because the bishop will come to d8, wrap up the pawn on a5, and very soon also the pawn on g4 can be regained. So that will be 2 extra pawns for white in the end. So black is keeping the queens on the board. Queen e8 played, keeping the bishop defended, and here king to g3, bishop to g7, attacking the queen. But there is queen e7. Excellent move. Once again, white is aiming for the exchange of queens. Black goes for queen b8 check. And now don't be too tempted to take a pawn, because the queen may be able to infiltrate. Bishop f4 is a very good move. Counter-attacking the queen. If the queen goes away, white can also put his bishop on e5 with a very strong threat against the bishop on g7. So e5 is played, but then another pawn is placed on this dark square, and that also means that the bishop can never really be activated again. Bishop g5, not minding wasting this tempo, as bishop f6, attacking the bishop on g7 is a new threat. Queen b6 guarding that square. And now it is bishop to e3, attacking the pawn on c5. Queen c6. And Magnus, up to this point, had been playing a model game. And here he has the possibility of taking the pawn on c5 or the pawn on g4. He decided here to take with the queen. And this is a serious error, because we understand he wants to go for the exchange of queens. But this does allow the move queen to f6. And the queen will enter on f3, probably. If you don't eliminate the pawn queen f3 with a lot of counterplay. So the pawn on g4 was captured. And there's queen to f1 with a huge mating threat on g2. Queen g2. So the king got to go back. This must have been seen in advance by Magnus Carlsen. And probably he felt very comfortable here. But This queen is a very strong piece. White should never have allowed the entry of this powerful piece, because if black goes here for the move queen e1 check, it's very difficult to get out of the checks. Even if you block with the bishop, there is queen d2 and you're hitting the pawn on c2, which is defended here still, but you're also about to give a check on f4. For instance, if you do take on a5, it's queen f4, king g2, queen g4. If you go here, there is queen to d1, and I don't think white is able to get out of the check. So likely this is going to end in a draw. But here, Ding Liren had a different plan. He is getting lower on time. He played a move bishop f6, so he's looking for this counterplay against the pawn on h4. Now, bishop f2 was played. Probably not the best move, because there is still queen c1. Same idea as in the other line, as the queen is heading for the f4 square. And even if you try to stop that with queen e3, then the pawn on c2 is taken. And this is anybody's game. A lot of things can still happen here. But Ding had a different plan. He played the move queen h1 to hit the pawn on h4. But now white has a very strong and simple maneuver, as queen c7 is played. Check. King g8, queen c8, king g7, gaining some time. This 10 seconds bonus every move. They're very useful when getting lower on time. And here finally the queen comes back to guard the king, offering the exchange of queens. Queen c1, well, still queen f4 or queen takes c2 is an idea, but definitely it's not as dangerous as before. Look, queen g4 played, attacking the pawn on g6. Now black has a choice, either to take on c2 or defend the pawn. If you defend with king f7, there is h5. You're opening up this king side, and you take with check, and if the king goes away, you can put your queen on e2, and you're 2 pawns up. I mean, it's not easy to mobilize your pawns yet, but you can consolidate your position. You can try to initiate the exchange of queens. This is technically winning for white. So black instead went here for the move queen takes c2, queen takes g6 with check, bishop to g7, and here you see that black is threatening to take on d3 or maybe even on b3. How should white deal with that? Should you try to defend the pawn? Well, if you go queen d6, then your queen is not as active anymore. White came up with a much better plan here of advancing the pawn to h5. Queen takes d3, capturing a pawn with check, but the king goes away to g2. It's absolutely safe, as the queen on g6 defends the pawn on e4. There's no good check here for black. Queen d2 played, preventing white from putting the pawn on h6 with huge threats against the pinned bishop on g7. But look at this. Magnus really wants to get rid of the enemy's queen. Play the move h6 anyway, threatening checkmate. The only move here to stop the mate and avoid the loss of material is to capture the pawn with the queen. But now if the queen takes h6, bishop takes, there is bishop to b6. And here you see at the end of the day, these pawns are really vulnerable. Of course, also the pawn on e5, and that is the difference. White can attack these pawns, whereas white's pawns are absolutely safe. They cannot be targeted by the black bishop. King f7, you're not in a rush. The pawn on a5 is not going away. You can put your king on f3, king e6. Now, bishop takes a5 was actually played, and here you're threatening to take on b4. Black resigned. There's no convenient way of defending that pawn. If you go bishop f8, then white is going to bring up the king to the queen side. Look, you can go king d7, king d3, king c6, king c4, and on the next move you take another pawn, will be 2 pawns up, game over. The alternative plan here could have been to put the bishop on d2, defending the pawn from a different angle, but there's king e2 with tempo, and anyway, the king will come to c4, after which the pawn on b4 can be taken. So, very, very nice game played by Magnus Carlsen. I really loved his middle game play, giving black a lot of weaknesses to deal with. So he built up the tension fantastically. Just on moment supreme, he just didn't convert in a nice way. In queen endgames, you know, there's always a chance for counterplay. So that's what he should have tried to avoid. He could have done that by If we go back to that critical moment where he decided to take with the queen on c5, he could have taken with the bishop on c5, for instance, when here you see the queen on e7 is fantastically placed. The black queen is unable to infiltrate. So that is a nice technical way of playing for white. Of course, still a long way to convert, but definitely it's much better than taking with the queen on c5, because after queen f6, all of a sudden black had a chance to fight back and save half a point, but well, that didn't happen. So anyway, very cool game in my opinion. The GOAT shows once again who is the real boss. Let me know in the comments what do you think of this game, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button, give this video a like, make sure to turn on the notifications as well, and then I'll see you very soon again.